This is the fifth in my series of Unitarians, Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists who made a difference. Clara Barton was a Universalist, and she was the woman who went to the field. As you heard from the poem that Karen so wonderfully read, there were other women as well, but she was the most famous woman that went to the field. This is her birthplace. She was born on Christmas Day in 1821 in this modest farmhouse in Oxford, Massachusetts, which her father had built. His name was Captain Stephen Barton. He had built it in 1818. He was a farmer and a member of a prominent family. It is now a museum, and you can go visit it. She had four much older siblings. Two of them were grown, and two of them were teenagers. I think the one that closest in age was 14, so you can imagine what life was like. Maybe that's kind of like Charlie, I guess. But you have these older folks all around you. And so she was like an only child in a way, with a whole bunch of parents. As an elderly woman, at the encouragement of school children who were studying about her, she wrote about her childhood. And here is an excerpt I'm going to read you from. It's called The Story of My Childhood. I was able to get it on Kindle and read some of it, and it's very good and very interesting. Here is an excerpt sharing her earliest memory. She says, "By the dates, I must have been nearly 2.5 years old, for I was born on Christmas Day, and now the lilacs were in bloom. Being the youngest by a dozen or so years, I naturally lacked child playmates and was left much to my own entertainment. On this occasion, I must have been enjoying a ramble by myself in the grass-green dooryard. Suddenly, my resounding cries brought the whole family to the door. 'Baby lost him, but pretty bird, baby lost him. Baby most caught him, pretty bird, baby most caught him.' Her mom asked, 'But where did it go, baby?' She pointed to a small round hole under the doorstep. Her mom screamed, for her baby had most caught a snake." That was her earliest memory. Although she didn't have a natural fear of snakes as a young child, she did have a lot of fear about her. Others report, and she does too, that she was extremely fearful and shy as a child. Her family struggled to help her. Her sisters taught her to read, and I don't have any pictures of her sisters that I could find. I just found pictures of her brothers, but her sisters did teach her to read. And when she was just 3, they decided that she should go to school with her brother David, who was teaching at a school. This is the picture of David. He taught her to love math. He was a mathematician. When she was 11, she became his chief nurse because he had a chronic illness. And that actually, they asked her to stay home and care for him. That's how she learned her nursing. She never went to a nursing school, but she cared for a good long time for her brother David. Her brother Stephen taught her to ride horseback, so he was very helpful as well in teaching her those kinds of things. This is her father, he was Captain Stephen Barton. He served as a non-commissioned officer and became her instructor in military and political lore. She said they would get down on the floor and they would play war games, and they would use beans and peas and things like that for the soldiers. Like kids today play toy soldiers, and they would do that, and he would explain to her the war games. Her mom, Sarah Stone Barton, was an independent woman known for her thriftiness and her temper. So there she is, and she's not smiling, is she? This is the youngest picture I could find of Clara Barton, other than the baby picture. Her parents tried to help cure her shyness by sending her to Colonel Stone's high school. It was a boarding high school. But this strategy turned out to be a disaster. She just hated it, And she wouldn't eat. She lost weight. She was depressed. So on looking back at her timidity and how it stayed with her, she wrote these words: "To this day, I would rather stand behind the lines of artillery at Antietam or cross the pontoon bridge under fire at Fredericksburg than to be expected to preside at a public meeting." This is a picture from the Devil's Den area. And the reason I'm including it is because this is the place that Clara ended up playing a lot of. When she was just a child, she actually ended up moving in with some of her cousins, and her mom and dad moved there with her as well. What happened was the father of these children died, and the mother could not continue the farm. So Clara's dad said, well, I will buy this farm from this cousin, and you can still live here with your children, and I will come over because my children are grown. They can handle my farm. I'll come over and help with yours, and you all can still stay there and be there. So then Clara had playmates. She had these boys, rowdy boys especially, and they would go hiking on the hiking trails, and they would go to Devil's Den. So this actually helped her to kind of come out from her shell a little bit now that she had these playmates. But it got her in trouble too. The boys would go ice skating on the pond. Now her dad said she could not go because she was a girl. Well, that didn't appeal to her, and the boy said, you can come with us. We'll come at night when he doesn't know. So they snuck out of the house at night and went down to the pond. They put some skates on her that didn't fit all that well anyway. Of course, she fell and got hurt, and they had to go back, and her dad was very upset. Now, in later years, he did let the grandchildren skate, the granddaughters, but at that time, he said he was afraid she would be a tomboy. That's what his concern was, so. Her parents, as she got older, convinced her that she should become a school teacher. They thought that may help her in her shyness. So she did. She began in 1838, and she continued for a decade and a half to teach. She was a very good teacher, and while she taught, she attended college, and she learned language, improved her writing. She went to a place called Bordentown, New Jersey that didn't have any public schools, and she thought, well, these children, the children that could not go to the private schools were just on the street. And she said, I'm going to do something about it. So she went to the city people, the counselors, and she said, if you let me use this building and you give me just a little money, I can have this school up and running for these children, for the public school. So they did, and she was very successful. The children came, they loved her, they were learning. The city officials saw how wonderful this was and decided to fund the public school fully, and so hired a man to come in and teach the children and made her the assistant teacher. She resigned. Then she went to work at the patent office in Washington. This is the old U.S. Patent Office. Some of you may say, well, that's part of the Smithsonian. It is now, but it was the old patent office. She moved to Washington, D.C. and began to work as a clerk in the U.S. Patent Office. This was the first time a woman had received a substantial clerkship in the federal government at a salary equal to a man's salary. She said, if I'm going to do it, you're going to pay me. I'm going to get paid the same thing. For 3 years, she received much abuse, though, and slander from the male clerks. Subsequently, under political opposition to women working in government offices, her position was reduced to that of a copyist. And in 1856, under the administration of James Buchanan, she was fired because of her black republicanism. That was the excuse for firing her. This was before the Civil War, and the Republicans were pushing, of course, for abolition and those kinds of things, and she was fired. Now, after the election of Abraham Lincoln, having lived with relatives and friends in Massachusetts for 3 years, is when she went there. And then, of course, Lincoln himself was elected, and the war came on. Many things changed then. April 19th, 1861, Massachusetts regiment was passing through Baltimore, and they were attacked. The wounded were brought to Washington, D.C., where she lived, and Clara's work began, and she volunteered to nurse them and nurture them. That's where she began it. She was in Washington anyway. They brought them there. She organized the ladies' societies to help collect supplies and materials. After that, she was called to the battlefield many times as well to help out. They found out about her great organizational skills and her great ability to raise funds and to get these folks to bring things in and to nurse folks, because she had all that practice nursing her brother. So that was the battle that was in Baltimore. This was a field hospital. These field hospitals were crude and they were dangerous. And initially they told her she couldn't go to the front. But she like the poem said, found ways to get there because she knew she was needed. And then once she started getting in there, they realized how valuable she was, and they wanted her to come to the front. She had a situation, I'll tell you how dangerous it was, though. Her garment that she was wearing, a shot rang out, the bullet went through the garment that she was wearing and into the man that she was nursing and killed him. So that's how close she came to it. Barton was known as the angel of the battlefield and America's nightingale. After the war, she began a huge effort to find the missing Union soldiers. There were so many that they had no idea where they came from. So she didn't have Google back then, did she, to try to help her out? So she did her best to find them. Where many of them were was Andersonville, right here in Georgia. Have you been to Andersonville, anybody? I'm embarrassed, I've never been. Need to do that. So Andersonville was a horrible, horrible situation for these soldiers, and many of them died because of the conditions, and they were thrown into these mass graves, put in these mass graves. But a clerk in Andersonville kept a copy, he had his own copy he made, of who was buried where. And she found out about that. She had put the word out through newspapers, the clerk contacted her, and then she traveled down to Andersonville, and they were able to find these young men where they were buried, give them proper burials, and mark their graves. They marked them initially with wooden plaques. Now you can go there, since then they had the marble plaques up, and they marked every grave for it. And then also she wrote to their families, told them where they were, and that they had had a sacred burial, and that their grave was marked. That was so important back then for families, and she did that. She spent that whole summer doing those kinds of things, and it's just amazing. And I'm going to go and see this and know now that Clara Barton did that. She did that. After war activities, she worked with members of the women's movements and civil rights movements. She got very progressive and very active in these things, including she finally decided that she could lecture. She had so much she had done and become quite famous by then. When she was a Civil War nurse, everybody heard about her being on the battlefield and what she was doing. So she was very famous, and she could make money this way. So that's what her job was. She would go and lecture and try to encourage people to do the right thing, including women's rights, civil rights. But she still had that timid nature about her, so it was kind of hard for her, and she ended up getting stressed out about it and losing her voice, literally lost her voice. The doctor advised her, well, this is what you need to do. And this is what they used to tell people, you need to go to Europe, go to Europe and rest, and get your voice, you're too stressed out. So she was a person that had enough means to do that. So she went to Europe to rest and to recuperate. But she just had the personality that she wasn't a resting kind of personality, So as soon as she could, she began to do other things there. In Switzerland, she became involved with a new organization, the International Red Cross. This grew out of efforts of the first Geneva Convention. I was unaware until I started preparing this of the connection between the Red Cross and the Geneva Convention. But the Geneva Convention, where they said, how are we going to treat prisoners of war and things like that, this was a definite part of this. They decided we have to treat the wounded no matter which side they're on. They began to make up these rules about how they would do these things. They needed a symbol. Well, they were in Switzerland. They decided to take the Swiss flag and just invert the colors. And that's where the Red Cross actually comes from, because the Swiss flag would be red background with white cross. That's where it came from. So they inverted the colors and they said, this is going to be our symbol, and we're going to treat everyone and make sure everyone is taken care of. They had all these countries sign it. She got involved with them. They wanted her to actually go back and have an American Red Cross, but she had more work to do before then. The Franco-Prussian War came out, and she said, I know what to do. I can organize this. She helped the International Red Cross. She organized medical supplies, and she went to the front again. Now, after the war, she decided she would go back home to organize the American Red Cross. But her efforts to get the U.S. to sign, and get them to sign the Geneva Convention, they did not sign it at first. They said, no, we don't need to sign this because we're not having wars over here anymore. We had our Civil War, now we're done. you know. So we don't need, you all are going to be warring over there. We're not going to get involved. We don't need to sign the Geneva Convention. So her efforts were to get them to sign on to that, and to begin the Red Cross. They didn't go along with that. They thought it was unnecessary. So she herself said, well, I don't necessarily have to have the government backing me up on this. I can do it myself. She organized relief efforts, and she said, you know, we may not have wars, but we have things we need to have relief efforts for. We have natural disasters. We have hurricanes, we have earthquakes, we have floods, and you need someone to organize these efforts. And she just said, you may not give me a charter, but I'm going to start it. And she did. She started the American Red Cross. And then chapters began to spread across the nation. Now, later on, the Congress did give her a type of charter. It is an independent organization, but they have given her some, it's sort of lifted up by the government as one. They don't sponsor it, but they've given her a charter at some point in time. Indeed, there were many disasters that did come, and she was ready when they did. One of the most famous ones was the Johnstown flood of 1889. Now, Johnstown had had other floods before, but this one was really a horrible one where the dams broke and things just went crazy and just really, really bad. Well, she organized, got donations from the entire nation. Everybody was giving for this to help out. She got there, it was, she couldn't find any place to stay at first, and just found one building that was kind of like a boxcar from a railroad. She went in there and started there. Then others came and brought tents, and she stayed there for a long time, organized all their relief efforts, and got a lot of notoriety. The Red Cross did, the American Red Cross, how they came to the relief of people in Johnstown. There were other groups helping too, but the American Red Cross, that's where they got so much of their publicity about what they were doing. Now, after that, she said, okay, I've got this in hand now. I've organized this huge effort, and I feel better about it, and I know how to do these kinds of things. There was a hurricane that came along our coast here in Georgia and in South Carolina, a very bad hurricane in 1893. And those sea islands all along the coast of Georgia and South Carolina were just devastated. And so she said, I'm going to go, I can organize it, just like I did for the Johnstown floods. I'm going to organize it for these islands. She tried to, but the donations did not roll in for these. They did not come in. She ended up with $1 for each victim of the hurricane, just $1. Well, now, basically, and she was very well aware, of what happened here. The people on these islands were African Americans, and people did not give for them. But she said, what are we going to do? We've got to do something. So she organized them to do for themselves. She got many of them working on various things. She got some ladies to send down their old worn-out dresses, and they undid them and were able to sew and make some simple things for them to wear. She taught them she got seeds and taught them how to plant gardens. They had never grown their own food because they'd worked on these big plantations that had these big crops, and then the plantation owners would give them the food. So they didn't know how to grow their own food. She worked with them on that and stayed in there she felt that they could take care of themselves. And they did. They were able to do that on a very small amount. Clara Barton continued to do these things. Every time there was an effort, either a war or a natural disaster, she was there with the Red Cross. In the Spanish-American War, she got in a little bit of trouble there because she had this big ship loaded up with supplies, and she was going to go to Cuba, and Cuba was blockaded, and so the ship was just sitting there in Miami. Well, there were some Spanish soldiers that had been captured and imprisoned, prisoners of war, and they had brought them over to Miami, and they were just in terrible shape and needed medical supplies and help. And she said, well, I've got them on my ship just sitting here. So she used those, gave them to the doctors that were helping take care of them. She got a lot of criticism for that because they said, oh no, you're not supposed to be helping them. But she was a Universalist, so she's like, no, they're sick, they're wounded, they need the help. In another situation, she went to Turkey when the Turks and the Armenians were fighting, and the people in America wanted to support the Christians, not the Muslims. Sound familiar, So she's over there, but she's on the battlefield, and whoever is hurt, she's going to help. So they got upset with her about that a little bit. They also got upset with her because they thought some people thought she mismanaged the finances. And she admitted, well, maybe she didn't keep as careful books as some people with some of it, but she was never known to be an autocratic leader. She never took a salary herself. But there were people in the New York office that were saying, no, you've been there long enough, we need a new person there. So finally, amid this internal power struggle in 1904, she did resign, and then she continued to lecture, but she did resign as the head of the Red Cross. She actually started after that the National First Aid Society, because she thought another thing that we needed to do was figure out we needed to train people to do first aid. That it didn't need to have a nurse come necessarily all the time, but everyday folks needed to know how to do first aid. That society was later incorporated into the Red Cross, and so now they do that kind of work as well. Here's some Clara Barton quotes. I give you some quotes from these folks that I think sometimes are just as helpful today as they were back then. She says, "I may be compelled to face danger, but never fear it. And while our soldiers can stand and fight, I can stand and feed and nurse them." She said, "I have an almost complete disregard of precedent and a faith in the possibility of something better. It irritates me to be told how things have always been done. I defy the tyranny of precedent. I go for anything new that might improve the past." She said, "I may sometimes be willing to teach for nothing, but if paid at all, I shall never do a man's work for less than a man's pay." She said, "Offering a hand up is not a hand out." And this was what she said in referring to the American Red Cross. She said, "Although its growth may seem to have been slow, it is to be remembered that it is not a shrub or plant to shoot up in the summer and wither in the frost. The Red Cross is a part of us. It has come to stay. And like the sturdy oak, its spreading branches shall yet encompass and shelter the relief of a nation." And it's still here. Now, some folks ask, was she really a Universalist? You know how we Unitarian Universalists want to claim everybody, don't we? Anybody that's all these famous people. Because when she was an adult, she didn't go to church. She was too busy praying with her hand and feet, So she didn't attend church as an adult. As she got older, though, some folks, some woman that she'd met before wanted to know, and she was a Universalist and was a member of a church, and she wrote to ask her about this. Clara Barton had attended her parents' church in Oxford, and so in 1905, she wrote a statement of her religious beliefs to Mrs. Thorman Thrasher in Lakewood, Ohio. Because she asked her, she said, "Are you a Universalist? Some people say you are, and some people say you aren't. We want to know, at my church." Here's what she said. "My dear friend and sister, your belief that I am a Universalist is correct as your greater belief that you are one yourself, a belief in which all who are privileged to possess it rejoice. In my case, it was a great gift. Like St. Paul, I was born free and saved the pain of reaching it through years of struggle and doubt." You all may remember Carol Simonson, those of you that have been here for a while. She used to talk about being a birthright Unitarian Universalist because she was a Universalist from birth. She says, "My father was a leader in the building of the church, which Hosea Ballou preached his first dedication sermon. Your historic records will show that the old Huguenot town of Oxford, Massachusetts, erected one of, if not the first, Universalist church in America. In this town I was born. In this church I was reared. In all its reconstructions and remodelings I have taken a part. And I look anxiously for a time in the near future when the busy world will let me once more become a living part of its people, praising God for the advance in the liberal faith of the religions of the world today, so largely due to the teachings of this belief. Give, I pray you, dear sister, my warmest congratulations to the members of your society, my best wishes for the success of your annual meeting, and accept my thanks most sincerely for having written me. Fraternally yours, signed Clara Barton." So we have her written evidence that she claimed herself to be a Universalist. And if you look at her life and how she lived it, I think that certainly her upbringing gave her those values. I think about this sometimes when I think about some of our children that grow up in this church and then we don't see them much after they're grown, and we say, well, they left us. But they've still got those values, and they live those values. So I would like for them to stay, but it's okay if they don't, because we've raised them here and they have those values strong within them. So I feel okay about it. You can see that Clara Barton did make a difference in the world. Universalism made a difference in her, and she made a difference in the world. Clara Barton was born on Christmas Day, and she died on an Easter Sunday. How about that? Now, she didn't resurrect in 3 days. But her legacy does live on, doesn't it? And her love that she gave and passed on still lives on. May it be so with us all.